Welcome back to Fischer Sherwin. This is part 4. If you remember from part 3, this was the part in the video where I asked you to see if you could find Fischer's breathtaking sacrifice in this position. And this is what Larry Evans said reminds him of Alekhine, where all of a sudden the tactic explodes like a thunderbolt. I admit, when I was playing Guess the Move on this game, I did not see this move coming either. I was imagining that there would be something much more positional at play. Uh, I thought maybe at some point, maybe Fischer might try to sacrifice this pawn in order to maybe try to get some play on this H file. But ultimately, what Fischer is trying to look for is he really wants to have some control on this f4 square. We've been looking at the potential skewer on this f4 square, and at this point, that square is dominated by the g6 knight. And the way that Fischer accomplishes his goal is really amazing. It's what Mato would call a killer move. So let me first return to the standard layout, and we'll return to the game. Fischer plays knight takes h7, and Fischer writes, throwing a monkey wrench into Black's carefully contrived setup. As usual, tactics flow from a positionally superior game. That's one of Fischer's most famous chess quotes, that tactics flow from superior positions. You'll find people using that quote all the time. I don't know if Fischer's the first one to say it, but it's extremely common. So Sherwin responds with knight takes h7, which makes sense, and he points out not king takes, because of course now the knight is pinned. The knight is pinned by the queen on this diagonal, and if so, because of that, then white is simply free to play f4 and just outright win the exchange. So plays knight takes h7. Fischer now plays h5, which of course is to dislodge the knight. And if the knight is dislodged, let's say, for example, he goes to knight e7 and then bishop f4, and Fischer writes, then of course white wins the clear exchange, having sacrificed the knight, but picks up the b8 rook after the queen has to retreat. But instead, Sherwin, he sees this, and so he plays knight to h4 instead. Fischer gives Sherwin the exclamation mark and says this is Black's best fighting chance. And it's a really, really, really good idea that he's going for. It's pretty interesting. So Fischer still gets to play bishop f4, and Sherwin plays queen to d8. And now Fischer plays g takes h4. Now, this poses the question, why in the world does Fischer not play, because you see it's available, why does he not simply take the rook? That seems like it's available, why not take it at that point? And it's a great question, and this is why knight h4 is the best fighting chance. So I want to invite you to pause the video and to ask the question, why doesn't Fischer take the rook on b8 and instead opts to take the knight with the pawn on g4? Please pause the video and see if you can find the answer. Okay, so Fischer plays pawn. The reason why he doesn't play is if bishop takes rook, what you have is you have knight takes bishop, and then after king takes bishop, bishop to b7 check. Now, of course, it's that revealed attack on the bishop on b8, and so then now Black is better. He now has two pieces for the rook, and he also has the initiative because he has this very strong bishop on the main light square diagonal. So he takes the knight, and he's still threatening the rook on b8, but then the rook then comes down to b7. And at this point, Fischer plays h6 and keeps the pressure up on black's king side. Pardon me. Fischer points out that what Sherwin is hoping for, he's aiming for a positional sacrifice, an exchange sacrifice in this position. You see, if at this position, if he still goes for exchanging the rook, let's see, he plays, bishop takes rook and then bishop takes bishop. Even though black is down the exchange, you see, as Fischer says, the initiative suddenly passes to black in spite of the material deficit. Now you see that white's king is actually a little bit more exposed than black's king at this point, and the bishop is very well placed as it can possibly be, attacking this long square diagonal. The queen could very well get into the attack. And so even though white would be up material, black would be much better, which is why, not necessarily much better than white, but much better than he would be if Fischer doesn't take the exchange sack. So Fischer instead just keeps up the pressure, and he plays h6, and Sherwin plays queen takes h4. Fischer writes, once again, time pressure had Sherwin bearing his thumbs in his ears. Fischer, of course, is very kind in describing his opponent. Instead of trying to mix it up, black should keep his king sheltered as long as possible with, and he gives some alternatives. He says he should play g6, and then after white plays h5, still trying to pry open the king side, g5, and then if he plays g takes h5 instead, queen e2, and you can see the attack there. And if instead, after g5, bishop e5, and with this position, which is how Fischer says that Sherwin should proceed, white is still a pawn up, but there should be fight left in the game. White is a pawn up, and he still has the advantage of the two bishops, and of course, if he can still maybe win the exchange if circumstances change and that becomes beneficial. But he says in this position, even though white is better, that black still has a fight. But he suggests that in this position, after queen h4, and he says this move is made under time pressure from Sherwin, that at this move, white is going to be clearly winning, and there's not going to be too much fight left in the game. Fischer plays h takes g7, and then black makes a mistake that I don't think even I would have made. He then plays king takes g7. Fischer gives this a question mark. He calls it suicidal, and he says the last hope would have been instead rook d8, bishop g3, queen h6, though he says queen e2 is hard to meet if, say, bishop b5, a4, a6, a takes b5, and so on. So he says that this is still very hard to meet, and white is still clearly better. But at least with the king not taking the pawn and moving the rook, he at least can try to hide behind white's pawn. Immediately when Fischer takes this pawn here, I knew that the only thing that could possibly save black is using white's pawn, the blockaded white pawn, as like a human shield for the black king. So by exposing his king with king takes e7, he now opens himself up tactically to all sorts of problems, because this rook is coming up very soon. And with this potential check, and if the queen can be forced to this file, there are horrible pinning predicaments. There's all sorts of horrible things that can happen. So Sherwin, by exposing his king, he has just made his exit come much more quickly. Fischer plays rook e4. I was very, very proud of myself for finding this move. Of course, the